The year was 1878, and the air over Red Creek, Colorado, carried the sharp scent of copper and pine. It was a booming time for the mining towns scattered across the Rockies. Small, dusty settlements where men gambled with their lives for a glimmer of metal. The town of Mason Ridge, perched between crimson cliffs and roaring rivers, was one such place. Its people lived hard, spoke little, and dreamed big. Every pickaxe strike was a prayer, every discovery a chance to rise from poverty to legend. That summer, the Red Hills Mining Company had set up a new site just outside town, on a ridge that shimmered with traces of ore. The crew consisted of 12 men, most of them drifters who had followed the copper boom from Montana to Nevada and finally into Colorado. Among them was Thomas Keene, a wary, sunburnt man with a miner's instinct and a stubborn streak that bordered on reckless. Keene had spent the better part of a decade chasing copper veins across the West, losing more friends than he could count to cave in fevers and false hopes. For weeks the crew had been working long days, hacking into stubborn rock that yielded more dust than ore. But Keene refused to quit. On the morning of July 12th, under a blazing sky, he swung his pick deep into a reddish seam and heard something he'd never heard before, a metallic echo, hollow and strange, like striking a buried drum. "Hold on," he called out, dropping to his knees. "There's something under here." The other miners, Billy Gorson, Harvey Finn, and a newcomer everyone called Doc, gathered around. They cleared the dirt with cautious hands, revealing a shape that seemed, at first, like petrified wood. But as they brushed away more clay, something glinted in the sunlight, a dull, reddish shine that didn't belong to stone. "Copper," Billy muttered, his eyes widening. "But that ain't no vein." The shape beneath their hands began to take forms: a ribcage, a spine, a skull, all coated in a thin, shimmering layer of copper. The men froze. For a moment, none spoke, the wind the only sound moving through the canyon. "What in God's name is this?" Doc whispered. Thomas reached out and brushed a fingertip along the skull. The texture was smooth, cold, and unmistakably metallic. Beneath the copper, faint outlines of bone could still be seen. It was a human skeleton, a man transformed into metal. By nightfall, the entire camp had gathered around the discovery. Lanterns flickered over the hillside, throwing orange light across the figure that now lay partly unearthed. A full skeleton, perfectly preserved, its bones encased in a natural armor of copper. Word spread like wildfire through Mason Ridge. By dawn, townsfolk were climbing the trail to see what the miners had found. Sheriff Alden Briggs, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and cautious eyes, arrived by midday. He crouched beside the find and scratched his chin. "Looks like some kind of trick," he said. "Maybe one of them art pieces from back east." But the miners shook their heads. "This ain't no trick." "Sheriff," Keene insisted. "We dug it up ourselves, clean out of the copper bed." They carefully lifted the figure and laid it upon a canvas tarp. Beneath the ribcage, they found something else. A small leather pouch, eaten by time but still intact. The sheriff took it and opened it cautiously. Inside was a folded paper, stiff from years underground. Though most of the writing had faded, a few words remained visible, buried here, that others may find what I could not. Signed E. Harrow. The name stirred murmurs among the older folks. "Elias Harrow," someone whispered. "That's the prospector who vanished near these hills back in '52, Sheriff Briggs frowned. "That'd make it over 25 years ago." He turned to Keene. "You boys might have just dug up the past itself." News traveled fast in the 19th century, faster than one might think. By the end of the week, the Denver Tribune sent a correspondent, and Dr. Henry Caldwell, a geologist from the Colorado School of Mines, arrived to examine the site. The scientists confirmed something astonishing: the skeleton had been buried in a copper-rich soil saturated with mineral-laden groundwater, which over time had caused metallic ions to replace the organic material in the bones. In simpler words, nature had turned a man into copper. But science didn't stop the questions. It only deepened the mystery. Who was Elias Harrow, really? Why had he been buried there, in a copper vein he'd likely discovered? And what did his final note mean? As the crowd grew, Mason Ridge took on the air of both a carnival and a pilgrimage. Locals brought flowers and candles to the site, Some believed the copper skeleton was a miracle, a divine sign or warning. Others saw it as a scientific wonder, proof of nature's strange artistry. A few saw opportunity. Offers came in from museums and collectors who wanted to purchase the remains. Thomas Keene refused them all. This man wasn't a spectacle, he said. He was one of us, a miner who gave his life to this mountain. He deserves more than to end up in some glass box. His words struck the town deeply. Even the sheriff nodded in agreement. The miners, who had known hunger and hopelessness, felt a kinship with the long-lost prospector who had perished chasing the same dream. Days later, as the townsfolk held a small gathering by lantern light, an elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd. She introduced herself as Margaret Harrow, Elias's niece, long widowed and living quietly in Mason Ridge. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My uncle believed the earth was alive," she said. "He used to tell me that copper was the blood of the mountains, and that if a man worked with honest hands, the earth would remember him kindly." She paused, looking at the gleaming remains. "Perhaps," she whispered, "it truly did." That night, under a sky scattered with stars, they reburied the copper skeleton on a small rise overlooking the mine. A simple wooden cross was placed at the head, bearing a single word, RRW. Thomas Keene placed the pouch and note back into the grave, sealing it beneath the soil. As he stood there, lantern in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain itself had wanted the man found, not for fame, but for remembrance. Years later, when the Red Hills mine closed and Mason Ridge began to fade from maps, the legend of the copper skeleton endured. It became a story told to children and travelers alike, not just of strange geology, but of the enduring connection between man, earth, and conscience. And in that quiet grave beneath the red cliffs of Colorado, Elias Harrow, the man who sought copper for others, not himself, rested in the very metal he once pursued, his legacy gleaming eternally under the soil. When the miners discovered the copper-coated skeleton in the summer of 1878, the name on the faded paper, Elias Harrow, rippled through the town of Mason Ridge like a long, forgotten ghost returning home. To the younger men, it was just a name, a relic of a story told by firelight on cold nights. But for the older townsfolk, the ones who had been children when Mason Ridge was just a scattering of tents and cabins, it was a reminder of something they had tried, quietly, to forget. Elias Harrow had been among the first settlers to set foot in the Red Hills back in 1850, long before Colorado was even a state. He wasn't a rough miner or a loud prospector like most men who came west chasing riches. Those who knew him described him as a man of peace and purpose, an honest soul with a dream too simple to be believed. He had come west from Illinois, carrying little more than a pickaxe, a battered Bible, and a journal bound in cracked leather. His belief was that copper, not gold, was the metal of the future. Gold, he once wrote, makes men greedy. Copper builds cities. He hoped to find a rich deposit, not to hoard for himself, but to create a fair mining venture that would pay honest wages to those who helped him work the claim. To many, that idealism was laughable in a time when every man in the Rockies was clawing for fortune. But Harrow meant it. He was known for sharing supplies, helping wounded travelers, and refusing to gamble or drink. While others staked claims in secret, he openly offered to share his discoveries with whoever would work beside him. In a world of selfishness and hunger, he was an odd light of decency. By 1852, Elias had built a small cabin by Red Creek, where he worked day and night testing soil samples and mapping the ridges. His logs, later recovered from his cabin, showed detailed notes, layers of clay, shifts in mineral color, and the unmistakable green-blue shimmer of copper carbonate in his pans. It was that same year that he found something significant, a deposit he believed would change the future of Mason Ridge. According to his final journal entry, dated December 17, 1852, he wrote, "The vein runs deeper than I've ever seen. Tomorrow I will follow it into the Red Hills. If my hunch is true, we'll have enough to share with every man who's labored honestly. Let it be for all." But Elias Harrow never came back. When a blizzard struck that week, the townspeople assumed he'd been trapped or lost in the mountains. A few men organized a search party, but it lasted only a day. Snow choked the ridges, and the winds made the hills impassable. The rescuers returned empty-handed. By spring, the talk had shifted. Some whispered that Harrow had found the copper and fled east with the fortune. Others claimed he'd been murdered by jealous miners who wanted his claim, but no proof ever surfaced. The mountain swallowed him, and with him his secret. As the years passed, the town grew. Mines opened and closed. Fortunes rose and fell. And though Mason Ridge prospered off copper and silver alike, few cared to remember the man who might have discovered it first. A handful of elders kept his story alive, mostly as a fireside legend, the man who shared too much. Yet beneath that legend lingered something heavier: guilt. There were men in Mason Ridge whose fathers had known Elias Harrow. Some had even worked with him before his disappearance. Old letters, later uncovered in town archives, hinted that envy and deceit had played a part in his vanishing. One letter, dated 1853, written by an old prospector named Reuben Cole, contained a chilling confession. Elias was too good for this place. He spoke of dividing what he found. The others mocked him, said he was soft. They followed him into the hills that night, saying they'd help him map the vein. Only 2 of them came back. I asked where he went. They said he slipped and fell into a ravine. I didn't believe them. Cole's letter was never sent. It was found decades later, folded inside a Bible at his cabin after his death. No one in Mason Ridge ever dared speak of it. By the time the town incorporated in 1861, the name Elias Harrow had nearly vanished from public memory. Only a handful of the oldest residents recalled his quiet voice and generous heart. So when Thomas Keene and his crew unearthed that copper-coated skeleton in 1878, and the name E. Harrow appeared on that water-stained note, the old-timers' faces turned pale. The mountain had returned what the town had buried in silence. The local preacher, Reverend Miles Carden, stood before the townsfolk that Sunday and spoke words that cut through the hush. Some men dig for metal, others dig for truth. God, it seems, lets neither rest forever. The legend of Elias Harrow took on new life overnight. Newspapers in Denver, St. Louis, and even as far as New York carried headlines like, "Colorado's Copper Martyr Found. Man of the Mountains Returns in Metal." Reporters wrote that the skeleton seemed peaceful, its copper gleam, as though nature herself had chosen to preserve him. Scientists called it an accidental miracle. But in Mason Ridge, it felt more like a reckoning. The rediscovery stirred a collective conscience. Some townsfolk began to speak openly of the old rumors. A few confessed that their fathers or grandfathers had been among those who followed Harrow into the hills. Others wept, realizing their prosperity may have been built upon the silence of an innocent man. Children began leaving small copper trinkets at the edge of the mine. Coins, belt buckles, even buttons, saying it was for Mr. Harrow. The town schoolteacher wrote in her diary that the children called him the man who turned into what he loved. And in that simple phrase lay something profoundly true. Historians would later confirm that Elias Harrow's disappearance coincided perfectly with the geological layers of copper where his remains were found. The deposit he discovered likely became the very foundation for Mason Ridge's mining industry. The town that had forgotten him had unknowingly lived for decades on the wealth his discovery had created. The legend transformed from tragedy to lesson. Harrow's story became a symbol of integrity, generosity, and justice, taught in local schools as a reminder that truth, though buried, always finds its way to the surface. So, when the copper skeleton was finally laid to rest again on that ridge, under a sky streaked in orange and gold, the townspeople of Mason Ridge gathered together in silence. Among them were the grandchildren of men who had once profited from Harrow's loss. No one spoke, but many cried. A single inscription was carved into the wooden cross above his grave: Elias Harrow. The earth remembered what we forgot. And from that day on, the town that once built its fortune on silence learned to honor the man who had built his life on honesty. The discovery of the copper-coated skeleton in the Red Hills had already shaken the small town of Mason Ridge to its core. But when word reached the larger cities, Denver, Chicago, and eventually even Washington, it became more than a local legend. It became a scientific enigma. Newspapers called it a man turned to metal. Others said it was a hoax, a myth, or even divine punishment. But none of the headlines could capture what the townspeople themselves felt when they stood before the shining remains of Elias Harrow. Awe, guilt, and a deep, haunting curiosity. For all their talk of faith and folklore, Mason Ridge was still a mining town built on earth and science. The miners knew copper veins, they knew minerals, they knew what happened to rock under heat and time. But this, a man preserved, bone and flesh replaced by copper, was beyond their experience. So when Dr. Henry Caldwell, a geologist from the newly established Colorado School of Mines, volunteered to investigate, the town welcomed him like a priest of reason sent to explain a miracle. Dr. Caldwell arrived in late August 1878, stepping off the stagecoach in a cloud of dust. He was a sharp, featured man in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of confidence that came from knowing both scripture and science. In his satchel were notebooks, magnifying lenses, glass vials, and a small portable microscope, rare and expensive equipment for the time. He made his way to the Red Hills mining camp, where a canvas tent had been erected to protect the remains. Inside, the skeleton lay upon a wooden table, carefully cleaned but untouched beyond that. Even under dim lamplight, the body shimmered faintly, a reddish-brown gleam that caught every flicker of flame. Caldwell stood silently for several minutes, then finally whispered, "Nature herself is the greatest sculptor." The miners looked on nervously. Some feared he would declare it fake. Others hoped he'd call it divine. But the scientist simply got to work. Over the next week, Caldwell conducted a series of examinations that would later become famous in geological circles. He began by taking microscopic scrapings of the copper surface and testing them with weak acids. The results stunned even him. Under his lens, he saw that the copper wasn't a coating like paint or rust. It had replaced the bone at a cellular level. The structure of Harrow's skeleton was still intact, but every cell had been slowly transformed into mineral. The process was known, in rare cases, as mineral replacement fossilization, but never before had it been documented with copper as the replacing element. He concluded that the body must have been buried directly in a copper-rich groundwater system, likely formed from the erosion of nearby veins. Over decades, the slow percolation of mineral, heavy water had replaced organic material, turning Harrow's remains into a literal metal relic. In his journal, Caldwell wrote, "This man was not sculpted by human hand, nor was he preserved by divine intervention. He was claimed by the earth, transmuted by it. In the language of alchemy, he achieved the impossible, man becoming metal." Despite the logical explanation, the townsfolk were not satisfied. Mason Ridge was still haunted by its moral ghosts. Science might explain the how, but not the why. Why had the earth chosen to preserve this man of all people? Why had the discovery surfaced now, just as the town's conscience had begun to stir? Caldwell, though a scientist, wasn't immune to that sense of wonder. Late one evening, he sat with Thomas Keene, the miner who had first uncovered the skeleton. They sat by the campfire, the stars bright above the ridge. "You believe in Providence, Mr. Keene?" Caldwell asked, poking at the fire. "I believe in hard work," Keene said, "and I believe a man gets remembered by what he does for others. Maybe the mountain remembered him better than we did." The geologist nodded slowly. "Perhaps," he said. "There are laws of nature we still don't understand. Ones that answer not just to chemistry, but to conscience." That line would later appear in the Denver Tribune's feature article about the discovery, and it would ignite debate from coast to coast. Soon, the skeleton was moved to the Mason Ridge Town Hall for public viewing and further study. People came from miles away, miners, scientists, priests, skeptics, and mothers carrying their children, all wanting to see the copper man. Caldwell oversaw every part of the process, documenting, sketching, and measuring. He treated the remains with respect, forbidding anyone from taking pieces as souvenirs. As had been done with other relics in the old frontier, he conducted soil analysis around the excavation site and confirmed what he'd suspected: the body had been buried in a natural copper seep, where water percolated through oxidized ore, depositing minerals layer by layer. Under the right balance of acidity and time, organic tissues could indeed become metal. It was science, but it felt like poetry. When Caldwell published his findings that autumn, His report titled, Copper Mineralization in Human Remains, a Case Study from Mason Ridge, was printed in the American Journal of Geology. It caused a sensation. Some hailed it as proof of nature's hidden artistry. Others saw it as a symbolic miracle, the earth preserving a man whose heart had been pure when others were not. One New York columnist wrote, "Science explains the mechanism, but not the meaning. The meaning lies with the people who buried him, forgot him, and now must face his gleaming return." As interest grew, offers poured in to purchase or exhibit the skeleton. The Smithsonian Institution sent an inquiry. Wealthy collectors from New York and London offered large sums. But Mason Ridge refused. The town council voted unanimously that Elias Harrow's remains would not be sold nor displayed beyond the valley. Instead, they would remain where they were found, a testament not to wealth, but to truth. Dr. Caldwell respected the decision. In his final notes before departing, he wrote, "Science has its limits. It can describe how copper flows, how minerals replace life, but not how the earth seems to choose whom it remembers. In that silence lies mystery." Years later, when Caldwell became a professor at the University of Denver, he kept a small copper fragment from the soil near Harrow's grave on his desk. Not from the skeleton itself, but from the ridge beside it. He would show it to his students and tell them the story of Mason Ridge. He would end every lecture with the same words. "Science and faith are not enemies, my friends. They are two lenses. One shows how the world works, the other shows why it matters. And sometimes, in the rarest of places, the two become one." In the decades that followed, the Copper Man of Colorado remained both a geological marvel and a moral symbol. To scientists, he was a case study of mineralization. To the people of Mason Ridge, he was something deeper, a reminder that nature itself bears witness to human truth. The mystery was solved in the laboratory, but its meaning endured in the heart. And long after the Red Hills mines fell silent, the copper beneath them still shone, not merely as ore, but as the echo of a man whose integrity outlasted flesh and time itself. The discovery of Elias Harrow's copper-coated remains had already drawn scientists, reporters, and curiosity seekers to Mason Ridge. But the most profound reactions came not from outsiders. They came from the townsfolk themselves. For the people of Mason Ridge, this wasn't just a geological marvel or a historical curiosity. It was a reckoning. When the name Harrow was spoken aloud for the first time in nearly 3 decades, a heavy silence fell over the town. It wasn't the silence of awe or wonder. It was the silence of shame. The older residents avoided eye contact. The younger ones whispered questions, and the church bells rang that evening for no one in particular. Because deep down, they knew who Elias Harrow had been, and many suspected they also knew what had happened to him. Back in the early 1850s, Mason Ridge was not yet a town, just a ragged mining camp clinging to hope and survival. Elias Harrow had been among the first settlers, a man of decency and fairness in a land of greed. He had dreamed of finding a copper vein that would bring prosperity to all, but not everyone wanted to share. The men who worked alongside him were not villains by nature, but poverty and desperation breed darkness. They had come west chasing gold, failed and turned to copper out of necessity. To them, Harrow's talk of sharing the vein with all was naive, or worse, an obstacle to riches they felt were owed to them. Over the years, this truth had been buried, just like Harrow's body. But when Thomas Keene and his fellow miners unearthed the copper skeleton, old stories resurfaced like ghosts from the Red Hills. Sheriff Alden Briggs, a man known for his quiet integrity, began asking questions. Not as a lawman, but as a neighbor. He spoke to the elders who had been boys during Harrow's time. Most turned him away or claimed ignorance. But one Samuel Crowder, then in his 70s, invited the sheriff inside. His cabin smelled of pipe smoke and dust, and on his mantel sat an old pickaxe, its handle worn smooth. Crowder's hands trembled as he poured coffee. "You're asking about Elias," he said. "I remember the night he vanished." "What happened?" Briggs asked. Crowder hesitated, staring into his cup. "My father and 3 other men went with him that night, men from the old camp. Said they were helping him stake the claim. But only 2 of them came back. One had a broken hand, the other a black eye. They said Harrow slipped and fell into a ravine, and they couldn't find him. But, his voice broke. My father never slept right again. He used to wake up shouting in his dreams. Sometimes I heard him say, "We shouldn't have done it." The mountain will remember. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When Crowder finished, Briggs stood quietly for a long moment before saying, "Maybe it finally has." That story spread like wildfire, and with it came others. A few townsfolk recalled seeing Elias's tools being sold after his disappearance. Others remembered that the first major copper strike near Mason Ridge, the one that made the town rich, was found not long after Harrow vanished. For years, people had believed that the mountain itself was Mason Ridge's greatest gift. Now, they began to wonder if that gift had come at the cost of a man's life. Guilt became a presence, something you could feel in the air, heavy and unspoken. In the saloon, laughter fell flat. The church pews filled with faces that hadn't been seen there in years. Even the miners worked quieter, their picks striking the stone like confessions. Children were told to pray for the copper man, though few understood why. The preacher, Reverend Miles Carden, gave a sermon titled, "The Blood Beneath the Earth." His voice thundered through the wooden rafters. A man once said, "Let this copper serve all who labor." And what did we do? We took his dream and buried it with him. But the earth does not forget. The truth, like the ore beneath our feet, will rise again. Many wept that day, not out of fear but recognition. Meanwhile, Dr. Henry Caldwell, the geologist who had studied the remains, continued his analysis, but couldn't ignore the emotional storm he saw unfolding. He noted in his field journal, "Rarely does science touch the soul of a town. The earth has offered them both a marvel and a mirror. What they see reflected is not the copper man, but themselves." His words would later be quoted in newspapers nationwide, earning Mason Ridge a reputation not only as a place of scientific wonder but of moral awakening. Still, not everyone welcomed the reflection. A few of the wealthier mine owners grew uneasy. Their family fortunes had begun with that first copper vein. The same vein Harrow likely found. If the town believed their fathers had wronged him, their prosperity might be seen as cursed. Rumors began that some families wanted the skeleton removed quietly before the story spread further. But Thomas Keene, now regarded as the discoverer and protector of the remains, stood firm. "No one hides him again," he said during a town meeting. "We buried our shame once. We won't do it twice." The townspeople cheered, and for the first time Mason Ridge felt united, not by wealth or ambition, but by the shared desire to make peace with their past. Within a month, the town voted to hold a public memorial for Elias Harrow. The copper skeleton was placed in a handcrafted coffin lined with pine and glass, so that the metal gleam could still be seen. The funeral procession wound through the main street, miners, widows, schoolchildren, and preachers walking side by side. The same mountain that had once buried its secret now echoed with hymns and the clatter of boots on gravel. At the grave site overlooking the Copper Valley, Reverend Carden spoke softly. "For 26 years, this man lay beneath our feet. We mined the earth he found, we built our homes upon it, and we forgot the hand that gave it. Let us now remember, not just the man, but the kind of heart that built this town before we lost it." Then, with the sheriff and miners lowering the coffin, the townsfolk covered Elias Harrow with earth once more. Not to hide him, but to lay him properly to rest. Afterward, Mason Ridge changed in small but meaningful ways. The mine owners established a fund for injured workers and promised fairer pay. The schoolhouse was rebuilt with copper trimmings as a quiet tribute. A plaque was placed in the town square that read, "Here lies Elias Harrow, whose hands found what others feared to share." The earth remembered him when we did not. And though years would pass and new generations would grow up hearing his story, Mason Ridge would never again be the same kind of town. The greed that once drove it had been tempered by remembrance. The copper beneath the hills still glowed with the same deep fire. But now, for the people of Mason Ridge, it no longer symbolized wealth. It symbolized truth, redemption, and the unyielding justice of time itself. By the time autumn settled over Mason Ridge in 1878, the story of the copper-coated skeleton had traveled far beyond Colorado's borders. Newspapers from Boston to San Francisco carried headlines about the man who turned to metal. Scholars debated it in lecture halls, ministers quoted it from their pulpits. But in Mason Ridge itself, the event was no longer just news. It had become a turning point in the town's soul. The discovery of Elias Harrow's remains, a man transformed by the mountain he once loved, had awakened something that neither science nor religion could quite define. It had reminded a community of miners, merchants, and mothers that a man's worth isn't measured by what he takes from the earth, but by what he leaves behind for others. The funeral and reburial of Elias Harrow had been a sight no one in Mason Ridge would ever forget. Hundreds had gathered under the clear mountain sky to watch the copper casket lowered into the soil. Some came out of duty, others out of guilt, but most came because they felt something larger than themselves, a quiet need to make peace with the past. When the ceremony ended, Reverend Miles Carden spoke words that would later be etched into the town's history. The mountain does not remember our greed or our fear. It remembers only those who labored in truth. This man gave his life seeking something for all, and even in death, the earth honored him more than we did. It was said that as he spoke, the setting sun struck the exposed copper along the ridge, and the whole valley glowed like a field of fire, as if the earth itself was listening. In the weeks that followed, the mood of the town shifted. The saloon grew quieter, and for once, Sunday services overflowed. Men who had once bragged about their luck at the mines began speaking of gratitude instead. Women who had long tended homes alone after losing husbands to cave-ins and fever found themselves part of something hopeful. A sense that maybe this land, harsh as it was, still carried mercy. At the heart of it all was the story of Elias Harrow, a man who had believed that copper was not a treasure to hoard, but a gift to be shared. That belief, once mocked as foolish, had now become the moral compass of Mason Ridge. The town council, moved by both public sentiment and conscience, made a decision that changed their history. They voted to use a portion of the profits from the Red Hills mine to build two institutions, a schoolhouse and a free medical clinic. Both would bear Harrow's name. The new school was built from timber and local stone, with a polished copper bell atop its roof. When it rang each morning, it shone in the sunlight, a symbol that education and compassion, not just labor and profit, could define a community. Inside, a small plaque hung by the door. Knowledge is the copper of the mind. May we mine it with honesty, as Elias Harrow mined the earth. The clinic, too, became a blessing to the people. Before it was built, miners often died from infections, fevers, and accidents that could have been treated if only there had been a doctor nearby. But with the new clinic, staffed by a young physician from Denver, lives began to be saved. Widows who once feared for their sons and husbands now had hope. For the first time, Mason Ridge began to feel less like a frontier outpost and more like a true community. Still, not everyone found peace easily. Some families carried guilt passed down from those who had betrayed Harrow years before. Among them was Samuel Crowder, whose father had been one of the men rumored to have gone with Elias on his final night. Samuel became one of the most active volunteers in town, donating labor and funds to the school and clinic construction. When asked why he worked so tirelessly, he replied quietly, "Maybe I can't change what my father did, but I can make sure we don't bury another good man's kindness again." In this way, the lesson of the copper skeleton spread, not as superstition, but as a lived truth. It became the unspoken rule of Mason Ridge: no one would be forgotten, no good deed buried, and no success claimed that was not honestly earned. Dr. Henry Caldwell, the geologist who had first explained the mineralization process, returned briefly the following spring to see the changes in the town. What he found astonished him. The people had preserved Harrow's burial site with care, surrounding it with wildflowers and copper stones arranged in a circle. The memorial plaque stood simple and solemn. He sought not riches for himself, but for all. Caldwell later wrote in his journal, "Rarely does science produce repentance." Yet this case did. What began as a study of nature's wonder ended as a study of human conscience. I came here to understand how copper replaced bone, but I leave understanding how faith replaces guilt. His writings would later inspire sermons, lectures, and essays across the country. By 1880, just 2 years after the discovery, Mason Ridge had transformed. Its economy still revolved around mining, but its heart belonged to something deeper. Each year, on the anniversary of Harrow's reburial, the townsfolk held a candlelight procession to the ridge. Children sang songs, miners placed their lamps along the trail, and the copper stones around his grave reflected the glow like tiny embers in the dark. The townspeople called it the Night of Light. No one was required to attend, yet everyone did. It wasn't a holiday of mourning. It was one of gratitude. They didn't celebrate the man for turning into copper. They celebrated what his story had turned them into. Better people. Years later, as the copper veins began to dry up and the younger generation moved to the cities, Mason Ridge slowly faded from the maps. The school remained, though, and the clinic continued to serve the surrounding valleys. The old mine entrances collapsed, covered by weeds and dust. But on the ridge, Elias Harrow's grave endured, untouched and gleaming faintly in the evening light. Travelers passing through often stopped to read the inscription and hear the tale from locals. Most left in silence, some with tears, others with newfound conviction. The legend of the copper skeleton became a symbol across the West, not of wealth, but of honor, humility, and redemption. By the turn of the 20th century, the story was retold in history books, sermons, and even early films. Yet in Mason Ridge, or what remained of it, the people never let the tale grow exaggerated. They kept it human, simple, and true. They would say, he wasn't a saint. He was a man who worked hard, believed in fairness, and never took more than he gave. That's why the earth remembered him. And so, the lesson of the copper skeleton endured long after the mines ran dry and the town's lights dimmed. It became a whisper carried on the wind that rolled through the Colorado hills, a reminder that time can bury truth, but it can never corrode it. In the end, the people of Mason Ridge learned what Elias Harrow had always known: a life lived for others is the only treasure that never turns to dust. And under the copper soil of the Red Hills, where sunlight still glints off the stones at dusk, the man who gave everything for others still rests, silent, steadfast, and shining forever as the conscience of a town reborn. By the dawn of the 20th century, Mason Ridge was no longer the booming mining town it once had been. The veins of copper that had once drawn thousands of dreamers to its rocky hills were mostly spent. The loud clang of pickaxes and the rumble of carts carrying ore had faded into memory. Yet, though the mines lay silent, something far greater remained alive: the spirit of Elias Harrow, the man who had become known as the Copper Skeleton. For decades, his name was spoken not just in Colorado but across America as a story of faith, humility, and transformation, both of body and of soul. But while many towns faded when their mines ran dry, Mason Ridge did not vanish completely. It endured quietly because of the values Elias had left behind, values that had turned greed into gratitude and despair into unity. His legacy, like the copper that once lined the mountains, still shone through the lives of those who remembered. By 1910, the Harrow schoolhouse still stood proudly at the heart of the valley. Its bell tower had tarnished to a greenish hue, but every morning it rang out strong and clear, just as it had 30 years earlier. Children still ran through its doors, carrying books with copper clasps engraved with Elias's initials, E.H. Their teachers told the story of the man who had wanted to share his discovery with everyone, a man who had been betrayed, yet whose death gave birth to compassion. Each year, on the anniversary of his reburial, the school would hold a ceremony. The children recited a short verse written long ago by one of the town's first teachers. He mined the mountain for all men's good, and left behind what others should. Though copper fades and towns may fall, his shining heart outlasts them all. Generations memorized those lines. They became more than poetry. They became a moral compass for the young. To the children of Mason Ridge, Elias Harrow wasn't a ghost or a myth. He was a guiding presence, someone whose sacrifice had built the world they lived in. Even as the Great Depression swept across the nation in the 1930s, the little community still clung to his teachings. When work vanished and hunger grew, the people of Mason Ridge did what their ancestors had done after Harrow's discovery. They shared what they had. The old copper mines were useless by then, but the soil still yielded enough to plant gardens. Families cooked large pots of stew that everyone could share. They called these gatherings harrow meals. An elderly woman named Martha Gable, whose grandfather had known Elias, would always tell newcomers he taught this town that copper was never the real treasure. Kindness was. You can't mine it, but it never runs out. During those hard years, people from neighboring towns would come to Mason Ridge for food, for rest, or for hope. Many left with full bellies and full hearts, whispering that the copperman's town was still touched by something holy. By mid-century, Mason Ridge had shrunk to little more than a cluster of families, a schoolhouse, and a tiny church, yet historians, scientists, and travelers continued to visit the site where Elias Harrow's copper-coated remains had once been displayed before his final burial. The grave was kept clean by local volunteers, and the copper stones that encircled it gleamed faintly each evening under the dying sun. In 1948, a professor from the University of Colorado, Dr. Margaret Yates, published a paper about the phenomenon. Her work, titled The Mineral Man, a case study in geological and human preservation, detailed how groundwater rich in copper sulfate had replaced the organic material in Harrow's body over decades. Yet what fascinated her most wasn't the science. It was the social effect. She wrote, "In Mason Ridge, science and spirit met in harmony. A man's decay became nature's sculpture. And from that transformation came not worship of the miraculous, but reform of the moral. The people did not turn his remains into spectacle, but into symbol. In that restraint lies their true greatness." Her essay was later reprinted in newspapers nationwide. It reminded people in an age of industrial greed that the pursuit of wealth without purpose leads to emptiness, while generosity can echo for generations. As the decades passed, the legend of the copper skeleton became part of America's cultural folklore. Radio hosts in the 1950s retold it as a tale of redemption. Sunday schools taught it as a parable about sharing and humility, and later filmmakers turned it into documentaries exploring the intersection of geology, faith, and humanity. But for the remaining families in Mason Ridge, the story was not entertainment, it was identity. They lived with the quiet pride of belonging to a place where a man's body had turned to metal and a town's heart had turned to gold. In 1978, exactly 100 years after his remains were found, a memorial ceremony was held at the ridge. Descendants of the first miners came from across the country. The event was simple: a reading of Harrow's note, a prayer, and the unveiling of a new monument beside his grave. The plaque read, "One man's dream became a mountain's memory. The copper has dimmed, but his light has not. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the copper in the rocks caught the last rays of daylight and shimmered faintly, as if the mountain itself was remembering." In the modern era, Mason Ridge is a ghost town, visited mostly by hikers, historians, and those drawn by the legend. The schoolhouse still stands, its windows cracked but its bell preserved in a local museum. The clinic has long closed, but its foundation remains, with a faint engraving on one of the surviving stones. "For all who labor, and for all who heal." Every now and then, a visitor finds a small fragment of copper ore in the dust and keeps it as a charm, a reminder of how nature, history, and conscience once came together in this quiet valley. Environmentalists later took inspiration from the Harrow story, citing it as an early example of ethical stewardship of the earth, the belief that what we extract should never exceed what we give back. Even today, mining companies reference the Harrow principle in educational materials: profit with purpose or perish with greed. As the 21st century dawned, few original residents remained, but the story still reached millions through documentaries, podcasts, and history forums. In schools across Colorado, students still learn about Elias Harrow, the miner whose bones became copper. But more importantly, they learn why it mattered. Because in the end, it wasn't the copper that made him legendary. It was the selflessness that time could not tarnish. Visitors to the Red Hills today still report a strange phenomenon. At sunset, when the light hits the stones just right, the copper veins flicker softly, like veins of fire beneath the soil. Locals say it's just mineral reflection. Others whisper it's Elias Harrow, reminding the world that integrity never dies. More than a century after his death, the legacy of the copper skeleton still shines, not in museums or books, but in hearts that believe one person's decency can outlast generations of greed. In a world that often forgets its heroes, the mountain remembers. And as long as the red hills glow at dusk, the man who sought to share his fortune with all will never fade. True wealth is not measured in metal, reads the last line on his grave, but in the light that others see because of you. And that light, even after 147 years, still gleams quietly over Mason Ridge, as steady and pure as the copper heart of Elias Harrow himself.